go to at least one football game, one basketball game, one soccer game. I'm not always successful, but I try, because I love like being able to kind of like connect with students on that level. Because some of them, like, they have parents who have never gone to their game before, and so I like to, like, it's as easy as, basketball games that like on a Thursday night at 7. Like, so one time during the basketball season, going out when you know that you have, 2 or 3 students on the basketball team and just cheering for them. Like, you don't even have to be there for the whole game. You could be there for like an hour and cheer for them, and they see you there and they realize, like, oh, wow, like Mrs. Lydon came to this game to see us. Like, and like when they get into college and stuff and they come up to you all excited to tell you about it, it's just amazing. Like, high schoolers get a reputation, I think, for being a tough group, being, hormonal and angry and angsty and all of that. But at the same time, they are like really wonderful people. They have dreams. They have all these ideas of how they want to improve the world, how they want to help other people. And I think it's amazing to get to hear that and to be trusted with, their ideas and their thoughts.
Hi, Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us about where you work and your background in education.
All right. Hi, I'm Maggie Lydon. I am an English teacher at Turlock High School. This is my 4th year teaching there. The past 2 years I've taught all seniors, and then the 2 years before that I taught a combination of juniors and seniors.
And what type of jobs led you into being a classroom teacher?
I actually started out my education thinking about going into the field of psychology. I got my bachelor's and master's in counseling psychology, and then I worked in that field for 2 years. I worked doing counseling with kids at Creative Alternatives, a foster family and group home agency. And I really enjoyed working with the kids. And after that, I worked at a neuropsychology clinic doing neuropsychology testing. And I found that I really missed working with kids and teenagers. And I wasn't really loving just kind of like the sterile environment of just doing tests every single day, day in and day out. And that's kind of when I was thinking about it. It's like my happiest times at work was when I was working with teenagers. They're so personable. Like, every day is different with them. So that's what I kind of realized, that I was interested in the field of teaching. And then that's how I ended up here.
Was there any, sounds like it was a gradual transition into being a classroom teacher, but was there any experience that you had with a teacher as a student or educators in your family, or is there any type of story that led you into this particular type of work, or is it just kind of something that you gradually kind of came into?
My sister's also a teacher. She teaches music up in Folsom. And she's 2 years older than me, so she had already been working in the teaching field for about 5 years, I think, before I got into it. And so she would always talk about, how much she enjoyed her job, and she would talk about how, like, there really was never, she didn't really have that moment where you like wake up and you're like, oh, I have to go to work today. It was more of a positive, experience as far as like working goes. And then when I was in high school, I had one really awesome psychology teacher that really like connected with students, like spent the time to build that like rapport and relationships. And so he's a teacher who kind of like inspired me too, because I was just thinking how great it would be if I was able to have, that kind of an impact on kids, in general.
Do you remember in specific what was inspirational about this teacher at all?
He would spend a lot of time talking with all of us. He would share stories about kind of like his life, like in relation to like the teaching content material, because he served in the military, like all this stuff, so he had all these great stories that related to psychology. And then so he would share a little bit with us about himself, but he would also take the time to just like check in with students, ask us how our days were going, and he would like remember what you told him. You would tell him about your dog that you had to take to the vet, and then like 2 months later he'd be like, oh, how's your dog doing? So it was nice. You made kind of a real connection with someone.
Excellent. You grew up on the East Coast. Can you kind of talk about your experiences with the education system there versus on the West Coast and in California?
Definitely. The East Coast has kind of a different feel as far as education goes. I grew up in Connecticut specifically. And over there, there's a lot more of a college specific focus. They have a lot of universities over there. I mean, we have a lot here, but they're spread out more. So there is very much like an Ivy League focus over there. The extracurriculars everyone was doing, it was more like music based, things like that. And I think it was kind of a higher stress environment as far as like you had to achieve the perfect test score. Like everyone had to get like 100%, like it was a kind of a more high pressure environment. Not to say here, the kids don't feel the pressure, but it was I think a higher pressure kind of thing. Whereas over here, there's more of a focus on the idea that you don't necessarily have to go to college specifically to be successful in life. You can go to college, but you can also, join the military. You can do like technical training. Like there are different pathways to success. So it's more of, I think it's more individualized in a way here. It's not like a one size fits all kind of thing.
Senior teachers spend a lot of time focused on what students are going to do after graduation. How do you feel teaching entirely to the senior class at Turlock High?
I love it. I love teaching seniors. It's really great because so on the one hand, they're older, so they're more mature than other high school students, although they're not all the way mature yet. Um, but it's really cool seeing like the ones that are planning on going to college. They tell you about where they're applying, and then a couple months later, they celebrate with you when they get in, to where they wanted to get into. You're kind of seeing them at their last moment before they like go off into adulthood. So it's kind of like one last opportunity to help them, succeed and get on the right path to achieve whatever they're planning on doing after high school. So it's I think it's unique in that, they really kind of understand that there's a definite impact of like what they do this year on their future. They're kind of at, because some other years they kind of feel like they have a lot of time left until they really have to worry about anything. Senior year, they get more serious about it all. And then it's also really cool. I mean, once you do get to the end of the year and you get to celebrate like graduation with them and prom and stuff like that, like it's really nice, and content wise, I feel like with seniors, they have more of a maturity that you can talk about, more difficult topics. Like for the past couple years, like, we read Brave New World, which is definitely like a more intense book as far as like the themes that come up in it and the situations that arise in it. And you couldn't necessarily have the same discussions with like freshmen that you can have with seniors. So it's kind of nice. You can get more in depth into certain topics with them.
How do you deal with senioritis?
Yeah, that's the struggle. That's the other end of things with seniors, because yes, they do know that the year's coming to a close, but then they realize the year's coming to a close and they're just over it. It is kind of the struggle, especially the last couple months of senior year, because they get to a point where they just feel like, well, I'm done now. And you kind of have to like emphasize to them over and over that it's like, you're not done yet. There's still more to do. I find it helpful to have more class discussions and things more towards the end of the year. So they kind of take more ownership over it. And it's nice because we end with like a project-based assignment, so that helps too, because it's kind of more on them. They're not just showing up and sitting there and listening. They're doing more hands-on type of stuff, which helps to keep most of them more engaged. So it's a struggle though.
Excellent. Well, what are some strategies when you think about your teaching? What are some strategies that you really lean on when you're instructing in the classroom? And another way to phrase that would be to say, like, let's say I walk into your room, if there were to be students, which there are not at the moment due to
Right.
the COVID-19 issue, but let's say I walked into your room, like what would a day in your classroom kind of look like, and what type of strategies would you be using as a teacher?
Well, first and foremost, I think the best way to have a good classroom management is to develop that relationship with students. So as they come in, I always like to like greet them, hopefully one by one, but sometimes they come in giant groups, so then it's more of a hey everybody. But to kind of greet them, strike up a little bit of conversation with them each day, because I kind of feel like even though it's just a little bit, like it builds up over time. They see you as someone who is, cares about them and who wants to engage with them. So I like to start out my day that way, just kind of like chit chatting with them as they come in and, check in with them. When we're doing different like lessons and activities, I do like to kind of follow that like I do, we do, you do model, where you kind of demonstrate what's expected. They do it together and then they do it more independently. I also do a lot of like pair share things. I don't like to call on students just kind of like out of the blue. I like to give them I give them time to write down their answer first. They discuss it with their partner or their group members, and then I'll call on people. So it's like even if they were unsure about their answer, like what they wrote, like at that point they should be at least semi-confident in what they're saying because they've kind of practiced it. So I really like doing that kind of thing no matter what the activity is, because it helps to keep them accountable for doing the work really, while at the same time kind of like respecting the fact that not every student is going to be feeling confident about whatever that topic is, about whatever their answer is. So I kind of feel like it has to do with like respecting that, and knowing that not every single book that you read, not every single unit that you do is going to necessarily be a student's like strength. So I never want to like embarrass them in front of everyone. So that's kind of how I handle that. During like the kind of like the flow of class, we teach ERWC. So there is kind of like there are pre-made units that you follow, but you don't have to follow it like to the every single letter. You have some flexibility in how you want to like present it and discuss it and talk about it. And so I always like to kind of start out with like a warm-up type question where they're kind of starting off with like the idea of whatever the topic is going to be that day and responding to it in writing and then discussing it with their partner. I try to keep like lecture type stuff to be short, like no more than like 5-10 minutes. Obviously, some days it might be a little longer depending on what it is, but I find it to be not that effective to be just standing there talking the whole time, because they start just zoning out, and it's hard to pay attention for hours on end. I try to mix up things, seat work with like getting up and moving around. So I'll do like different like posters around the room that they'll get up and write things on the poster and go around and discuss with people. As many chances as I can to get them out of their seats and like moving and engaging. I take, because they do spend a lot of time throughout their school day just sitting in desks, so they can kind of check out pretty easily. I use Google Classroom a lot. I have them type up their daily written responses on there. I manage that with GoGuardian. I have it set so that they can only get on Google Classroom and Turnitin.com, and that's it. They can't get on any other websites during class time. I used to be more flexible with it, and I would let them access other sites, but they just got distracted a lot. So now that I've changed the settings to be like that, it's really not been a problem at all. They can only go on Google Classroom and do their work, so it's worked out pretty well.
You mentioned trying to avoid embarrassment among students. Let's say that you have, because the primary audience for this video is going to be teachers that are in the credential program, and they're about 2 to 3 months from graduation. So they're either in an internship now, and then they'll be looking for a job, or they're finishing up their student teaching, and then they're going to be on the job market, and then hopefully starting an assignment in the fall if there are students in desks. And so if a teacher's struggling to get students talking, especially in a class like English where there's a lot of room for opinion and debate and things of that nature, You mentioned making sure that students didn't feel embarrassed. Is there anything you can say about making students feel comfortable to speak up in class? I mean, you mentioned having them write down what they were going to say first, which I think is a huge help, and especially EL students or special needs students in formulating their thoughts before they're expected to perform in front of the classroom. But in terms of making students feel comfortable to share out how they feel and what they think, do you have any suggestions or tips you could give as far as that's concerned?
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of starts out with your start of the school year kind of like rules and guidelines. In my classroom, like I have a big sign that said, like, it's across the top of the whiteboard that says build each other up. And so I talk about that at the start of the school year, that, we talk about a lot of different topics in our classroom. And you may agree with someone, you may disagree with someone, but at the end of the day, whatever your opinion is, that's fine, but it's not an opportunity to like tear someone down. And and I talk about, maybe someone will raise their hand and attempt an answer, and that kid is wrong. I talk about, like, that's not your opportunity to like make fun of that person. That's someone who is genuinely trying to learn. So if you know the answer, then you should raise your hand and be like, oh, actually, this is, what I think. So I think it starts out with kind of setting those norms and rules and boundaries at the start of the school year, as far as like how they should and should not respond to other students, especially when it comes to debates and things like that. Because while they are seniors, so you hope that they're more mature, sometimes they want to, tease each other or make fun of someone. And you really have to be on guard with that. Because it can be hard to tell sometimes, because sometimes they'll tease their like friend and it's just kind of like funny teasing between friends, but as a teacher it's hard to determine what that is. So I usually kind of set that boundary of like, we're not teasing each other, we're not making jokes about what anyone says. And I talk about how important it is to have an open platform basically for ideas and discussions. So I really think it's important to set that up at the start of the school year, and then you have to follow up on it with, because it's going to happen that somebody's going to make some sort of comment about what someone said, or like laugh at what someone said. So you have to be there right away to follow up with your expectations. So that, right when someone laughs at someone says, you just have to say, that's not acceptable, and explain why. And then even with those boundaries kind of set in place, there will still be some students who feel unsure or embarrassed about sharing. And with those students, I usually try, because you get a feel for who those students are usually. With those students, I'll still call on them like anyone else. And I will usually, no matter what they say, find something positive to respond to in their answer, to kind of give them that support of like, yes, like I see you, like I can see where you're going with that. Because these are students who maybe, aren't used to getting called on in class, or they're used to, if they get called on, like other teachers maybe just let them say like, oh, I don't know, and then like moved on. So for some of them, it could be, their first time really getting held to answering the question. So I think having a lot of like positive feedback for what they say is important.
And then you mentioned Google Classroom. What do you feel like are the advantages to having a lot of technology in the classroom? Turlock High is 1-to-1 for the first time this year. You mentioned GoGuardian, Google Classroom, Turnitin.com. I mean, what are your thoughts on technology in the classroom? Has it improved your teaching quite a bit, in your opinion, or what do you think?
I think it has improved teaching. Some people complain because they're not spending as much time writing, and they can get more distracted on the computers, which GoGuardian helps a lot with if you have that set up properly. I think above all, it teaches students typing skills. A lot of my seniors at the start of the school year, I'll, just be walking around while they're working on something, and they're, like using one finger to like, type on their keyboard. Because a lot of them, we assume that they're so like computer literate because they're around technology all the time, but they're more like smartphone literate. A lot, like at the start of the school year, I'll get so many kids that will raise their hand and ask me like, well, can I just get onto Google Classroom on my phone and type my answer with my phone because it's just so much faster? I tell them no, you can't. So throughout just this one school year, each day they're answering at least one question on a Google slide where they have to type their answer. And just watching like their kind of informal progression throughout the school year, where most of them are just kind of like finger pecking the keyboard, to the end of the school year where they're actually typing proficiently. I think it teaches them a skill that they have to have for college. You know, most college classes now are computer based. I can't even remember the number of essays I wrote for college, but it was a lot, you know? So it's one of those things that it's a skill that they need to have. And a lot of them coming into senior year, I noticed that they don't have, because they're coming from, you know, classrooms where the teacher chose to have more, you know, handwritten based assignments, which, you know, is totally understandable. But I think especially like senior year, it's important to make sure that typing is in their skill set. So I think above all, that's the most important thing that comes out of using technology. The other thing I really like is that before we had Turnitin.com, we would have these like daily like questions that they would answer. And when they were handwriting it, it was a huge pain to track down who was copying from who. Because you would read a response and you'd be like, like that sounds familiar. And then I would tell my students, like, I'm a crazy person. I will dig through this whole stack of paper and find who else met. But obviously that took a lot of time. And so with Turnitin.com, like, so I have them create a Google Slides presentation. And then for each written response, I had them title it a certain thing, and then they type their answer in the text box on the slide. And so Turnitin.com, you can upload Google Docs. You can also upload Google Slides, and it automatically checks for plagiarism and copying between students at your school. From the entire school. So, you know, if I upload an assignment and another English teacher uploads an assignment, it'll check between teachers. It also checks the entire internet, basically, for any similar responses. And it sends you a little report, and you can see, you know, it highlights anything that is not original. And what I really like about it is that the students can submit an assignment, and then they can click on it, and they can see if their work has been flagged as being not original. So it does give them kind of like an extra opportunity. They could go back and fix it, you know, do their own work, and then re-upload again. So I've noticed it's cut back a lot on the problem of plagiarism and copying, which is always something, you know, we have to worry about, is that the kids are actually doing their own work. So I think that's, second of all, is a huge thing for me.
What are your thoughts on plagiarism? Why is it such a big deal, and what do you think we can do to fix it?
So I think a lot of students get used to doing assignments and then teachers maybe not necessarily reading the whole thing. You know, because I'll have students that will tell me that they'll turn in assignments, and they kind of feel like they could have written anything down and they'll still get points for it. So I'll have some students that, especially the first assignment they submit for me, that's, you know, the big one that they all realize all of a sudden, like, oh wait, you caught me. You know? And so that's usually when they say, like, well, I didn't think you were actually going to read it. And it's like, well, look, guys, like, I mean, I do read it all, but I don't even have to read it. Like, I'll show them like a sample like report, basically, where it's like, look, like, even if I didn't read it word for word, you know, this is all highlighted. So one reason that students say that they tend to copy from others is that they just think they won't get caught. And unfortunately, they have the experience in some classes where they don't. Because, you know, there is only a certain amount of time to grade everything. So if a teacher isn't using Turnitin.com, it can be really hard to notice that, you know, maybe this response is the same as a response that you read like 130 assignments ago. You know, like, that's pretty hard to catch. Secondly, I have a lot of students who are involved in a lot of extracurricular activities and a lot of other classes, really. I mean, for seniors, they can go unscheduled, but the vast majority of our students have 6 periods of classes that they're taking. So it's also kind of them figuring out the balance between, you know, when to get all of their work done, which, you know, like many of us, they procrastinate. And so then right before something's due, they panic, and then they try to, you know, just copy what someone else has to make up for it, to get those points. And so I always have to talk with them about, like, look, you know, each assignment is worth, you know, 10 points in this packet. If you're missing one, isn't it better to just lose the 10 points on that one than to get in trouble for plagiarism, you know? So I have a lot of kind of heart-to-hearts with them about that, because it's, you know, I try to impress on them how serious it is, you know, in your future. If you go to college and you're plagiarizing, like, there are serious repercussions for that. And so a lot of them don't quite like realize, I think, during high school, like how serious it is, because to them it's just like kind of like, oh yeah, oops, I copied from my friend. You know, they don't see it as kind of like a serious issue, which is why I think so many of them do it. So I think that's part of what I do, is trying to impress on them, like, no, really, you have to do your own work.
Excellent. So plagiarism is a huge problem in teaching English. And thinking of challenges, what do you feel like as far as your career has gone thus far as a teacher? What's been one of your greatest challenges, and how did you overcome it? Because again, the audience, these students are stressed out because they're finalizing TPA submissions. They're thinking about induction. They're worried about going on the job hunt. They're maybe dealing with conflicts between their supervisors and their cooperating teachers, and they have a lot on their plate. So when veteran teachers are able to tell stories about the challenges they've had and how they overcame them, I think that those stories really are inspiring for the students that'll be watching the video. So can you share one with us?
Sure. I think my biggest challenge for my first year teaching was figuring out how the heck to grade everything in a normal amount of time. I would be in my classroom, you know, sitting there until like 6 o'clock at night grading papers. And me and this other teacher, we actually went through the credential program together, and so it was our first year together. We were in the same hallway. We would see, you know, out our windows, all the other teachers going home. We would be, I would go talk to her and be like, like, how do they do it? Like, how are they not here still? So it took a long time to figure out like how everyone really did it, like how everyone like managed to get all that grading done. Because I was like, you know, you see some teachers, you know, at school, after school, but I would say for the most part, most people seem to be gone by like 4 o'clock ish. For you know, unless it's like right before grading is due or something. But for the most part, I never really see like a ton of people staying there super late. And so my first year, I was like shocked, because I was like, I have 150 essays to grade. Like, how are all these other teachers like done? Like, how do you manage it all? So it was a really big struggle. I think my entire first semester, I stayed on campus until at least 5 o'clock every single night, like just trying to get grading done, because it's hard to adjust to the fact that it all just keeps coming and coming. Like, all of this work is constantly getting turned in, so it's kind of a matter of figuring out how to balance it. So then I, like, second semester, I kind of like set a rule for myself that I was like, no later than 4. Like, look, we get done at 2:51. Like, that's, you know, an hour, 10 minutes to like grade stuff, you know, plus my prep time. And I was like, more than that, like, look, like, I need to have a life too, you know, because like, it gets stressful if you're at work until, you know, 6 o'clock at night. You know, you only have so many hours with your family every day. And so, and that's just grading work. That's not planning work or creating lessons, you know. So with all the influx of grading, I kind of worked out a system for myself, and I tell students this, like, when it's something major gets turned in, like an essay, like, I teach 5 periods of seniors. So anytime they turn in an essay, that's 160-ish essays to grade. And so, you know, I tell students that it's like, look, I have 160 of these to grade. I always do my best. Well, I always finish grading work within 2 weeks of it getting turned in. And so with smaller assignments, that's easy, you know. With bigger assignments like essays, it's more of a struggle. So I kind of figured out a system for myself, because I'm someone who, like, I would sit there, like my first semester when essays got turned in, I would sit there and I would have like my stack of 160 essays, and I would sit there and just grade them all, like, just get it done. And I realized, like, why am I doing this to me? You know, like, so I kind of, like, for essays, for example, I'll grade like 1 period's worth every 2 days. So, you know, I have usually around like 32 kids per period. So it's like 15, 16 essays a day. So, you know, I think putting grading into manageable chunks was something I had to figure out. You have to figure out a system that works for you. So for me, you know, if I have 16 essays to grade a day, you know, that I have my prep period. So I'd be like, okay, like, maybe hopefully get 8 done during my prep, and then the other 8 after school. But I really think it's important to set limits for yourself, because when it comes down to it, you're going to get it all graded, you know, like it's going to happen. it doesn't make a difference to the kids really if you get it graded in 2 days or a week and a half. Like it doesn't really seem to bother them at all. They will talk about, some teachers don't give them back their grades for like a month. So my students are always like, oh, 2 weeks, that's so good. And I'm like, thanks guys. So I think it's really like kind of finding what works for you. But also keeping in mind, like your first year teaching, like I was exhausted, like, cause I know, most like other jobs, yes, you work till 5, no, so sometimes people hear me talk about it and they're like, well, other jobs work till 5, but it's a whole different level of like, you're just exhausted. Like my first semester, there's something about, you're standing in front of those kids and there's so much you have to pay attention to all the time. You have to keep an eye out for everything, and respond and like think on your feet. It's like physically and emotionally exhausting. So I think it's important to make sure you have time for like yourself and your family and self-care. And so that was my biggest struggle, was trying to balance like grading with my regular life. And it's important to keep in mind, like you can't just sacrifice yourself and like your own happiness in your relationships just to get stuff graded quickly. It's like, so like I said, for me, I kind of set a limit of like 2 weeks for myself for getting stuff graded, and usually that's plenty. Sometimes it's not, and then I just tell the kids like, well, sorry guys, I procrastinated like all of you do. And and they laugh when stuff like that happens, because that's the thing, is like they're flexible when it comes down to it. So that's one struggle I had, which luckily I figured out.
When you made that transition from staying every night until 5 or 6, was there like guilt involved? Like what I mean by that is, did you feel like you had to have a conversation with yourself and make a concerted effort to change your perspective about grading so that you wouldn't feel like you were shortchanging students or that you weren't doing the job correctly? Because I'm envisioning people that will listen to this and they'll be like, I can totally identify with that. Like when I get all this stuff to grade, I feel like I need to get it back to them as soon as possible. And I need to turn my phone off and turn my TV off and ignore my spouse or my girlfriend or my boyfriend. So I think where I'm leading is like, what can you say to, how do I give myself permission to ease up on the pressure that I'm putting on myself? Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does.
Okay.
And I think that's a huge part of it, is because we get so worried about providing like timely feedback to students that, it's part of their education is, you have to give them some sort of feedback about how they did on whatever the skill was that you were measuring. So I think it's definitely giving yourself the permission to take some time with that. And kind of the way that I came to terms with it is that, first of all, like you're checking for like skill mastery in smaller ways all the time, really. You can do it with exit tickets. You can do it with just informal stuff, checks for understanding in your classroom. And for the bigger things, like for English, like essay writing, or even, if you write like an argumentative paragraph or something, there are some skills that it just takes longer to assess. And so, for example, essay writing, if I take 2 weeks to grade an essay, I came to the realization basically that when you get it back to them, it's still relevant to talk to them about whatever problems you notice came up. So what I do when I grade students' essays, first of all, another thing I did is I realized I had to put a limit on how much written feedback I gave them about the essay, because my first year, I would write something for every single mistake, like stuff they could fix, like comments here and there. And then you see a student like get it back, they look at their grade on the top and then they put it in like the recycling, and you're like, no. And so the way I do it is that for each essay I write, I have a rubric that just has like numbers so they can see specifically where they lost points. So like it'll say like, introductory sentence for, their body paragraph, and it's worth 5 points. So if they see that they got a 4 out of 5, they know it was maybe a little weak. So other than the number scores, what else I would write on it would be the top 3 things that they can do to improve. Because I kind of realized that correcting every single little mistake is probably a little disheartening for them, like the ones that have a lot written, and I was like, and are students really going to remember all of that feedback, because you have a tendency to want to give them a lot of feedback, because again, you want them to learn, you want them to do well. And I kind of realized that it's like, if I give them the top 3 things to improve, then hopefully they'll be able to fix those 3 things the next time that we write. And so I kind of came to that realization that it's not necessarily always about giving them feedback quickly, like as fast as possible. It's about giving them quality feedback. So the top 3 things that I write on essays, it's always things that are directly applicable to the future essays that they write. So if like a lot of students, like for example, this year have had problems with thesis statements. So I'll give, number 1, I'll write thesis statement, and then I'll give them some sort of specific feedback about how to improve their thesis statement. So that way when I kind of compile a list of the types of recommendations that I'm giving. So when I'm done grading a period's worth of essays, I'll look and I'll see like, okay, like, for 12 different students, I wrote about their thesis statement needing improvement. So then the day that I give essays back, I'll basically have like a slide up, and it'll have kind of like usually like the top 5, whatever number I pick, like the top 5 things that people needed to work on. And I'll talk about those things. So even though it's been 2 weeks since they've written it and turned it in, it's still a relevant conversation. And that's the thing, is like, I kind of realized that you have to give yourself permission to take a little longer when needed, because I think it's better to give quality feedback anyway. And I think the vast majority of teachers, the skills that you're teaching aren't just like in isolation. They're things that you're building on. So even if it's been 2 weeks or 3 weeks since they turned in the assignment, whatever feedback that you have to give to them, it should still be relevant to whatever you're talking about. So I kind of realized that, and then in combination with the fact that there are other smaller checks for understanding that you're always doing, I just realized that it's not necessary to kind of, sit there till 6 p.m. So, I was getting essays graded like in like 3 days after they turned them in. And it's like, I haven't noticed much of a difference between, the times when I would give them an essay back 3 days later, and now when I give them an essay back 2 weeks later. The kids respond the same way. They respond to the feedback the same way. So I think it's kind of giving yourself that like grace and understanding to like realize that, it's like, I need mental health time too. Like, I need a break too. Because teaching is a job that's hard to just be done with for the day. Even when you're not grading, you're kind of thinking about whatever you're doing the next day, or like you're thinking about, how a lesson went, or maybe you're thinking, maybe some student said something really mean, and you're, thinking about, the mean statement some kid. So it's easy to get really wrapped up in the job and to always be focused on it. And so I think it's just giving yourself permission to just, like any other job, like put it down for the day and, go home and like live your life. So but I definitely do think that like feeling kind of guilty about, you want to be the best teacher that you can be, but sometimes that means just giving yourself some space and room for your own personal life too.
So speaking of students who maybe make mean comments, how do you deal with in your classroom? Let's talk about 2 types of students. Ones that don't really want to engage. So students that head down on the desk, arms crossed, AirPods in, just really reluctant, to use a polite word, to engage. What type of tips or strategies could you offer for students that aren't disruptive necessarily, but just are hesitant? And then another group of students, disruptive students that are outwardly defiant or that are causing problems in the classroom with open disruptions. What are your strategies in dealing with those students?
Okay, so for the reluctant to engage ones, so my students started like teasing me about it, because pretty much every class period this year, I start out with like, hey guys, good to see you. Let's put our phones and our earbuds away. And then there's always, a couple that they have their hair, but you're like, I still notice some people with some earbuds. Let's wait until everyone's earbuds are away. So being, I guess a little obnoxious in a way about that. Because the other kids, like for the vast majority of students, like they want to like get their work done. They don't want to have like homework to do or something like. So when I make a comment like, oh, I noticed some earbuds are still out, all of a sudden you see the other students like looking around like, who is it? Who has their earbuds out? And so there's a little bit of like the social pressure to like, let me put these away, But you have to stay on top of it, because if you don't say something, about putting their phones and earbuds away, they're gonna have them out. Like they're like, and a lot of them don't even like, they won't even have their music on. They just like have it in their ears, and I'll be like, it's like, it's not like a body part. Put it away. Like, why is this out? So I normally head off the earbud thing at the pass with that. And so one of my students, he was doing an impersonation of me, you know, in a nice, it was funny. But he's like, okay, class, put away your earbuds. And I was like, yep, I do say that because y'all need to hear it every day, you know? But I do have the problem of, you know, kids who will try to like put their head down, or who will sit there and basically not want to do anything. You'll tell them to discuss with their partner, and they'll sit there, and you'll see their partner like look at them and then be like, oh, okay. And then like just not. So one way that that's handled in my classroom is that I have participation points. And I tell the kids, you know, you get participation points for being here and participating. So that means that if I asked you to discuss with your partner about something and you choose not to, and I see that you're just sitting there, you're going to lose points. So a lot of the kids are, you know, really grade motivated, you know, so that can help a lot. And so if I see students who aren't discussing, I'll just kind of say a reminder of like, oh, I noticed some people are choosing not to discuss. Please keep in mind you'll be losing participation points if you make that choice. And then usually that's enough for them to be like, oh, I should, because I mean, really, it's not that hard to discuss what you just wrote. So a lot of times that will kind of like gentle prodding to like participate and to keep up. There are some kids though that sometimes that they'll just, you know, have their head down. And you'll kind of notice it's like for some kids, if you notice them being like that and it's not really characteristic for them, I think you have to make a judgment call sometimes, because sometimes you'll see kids that are normally maybe not like the most outgoing, but like they'll usually participate, and sometimes you'll see kids like that well, I never let them put their heads down. I always ask them to sit up, but you'll see a kid sometimes that they'll just be like, you can tell like just checked out, you know. And if it's not typical, I usually will wait until basically the bell rings. Like usually I'll just give them the space, because I don't like to ask them personal questions like in front of everyone. But usually I'll kind of like give them space for that class period, and then at the end of the class period I'll call them over to talk to them. So that way it's just me and them like one-on-one, and I'll just tell them like, you know, I noticed today, like when you were supposed to be discussing, you weren't. When you were supposed to be writing down answers, you weren't. Like what's up? Like that, you know, that's not normally how you are. And usually it's the case that there's something. So normally, like usually it's the case that if it's not typical for them to be acting like that, it's usually the case that there's something going on in their lives. Maybe like they're having some sort of family conflict issue, maybe, you know, some sort of personal relationship. So I think it's important to be aware of the fact that it is kind of a kid by kid basis. So for a kid that's, you know, maybe they're like grandma is sick and dying, like that's probably not the kid that you want to in the middle of class be like, hey, you, like, why aren't you participating? You know, like you're not going to get a good response. So if it's a student who normally isn't like that, I usually like to wait until the end of class to talk to them. Or if it's like, you know, the beginning of class and you can tell that something's up, I'll just ask them to like step out in the hall for a second just so I can talk with them. And usually they appreciate it. Like I always like frame it as, you know, like it's out of concern for them. Like I don't call them in the hall and be like, well, you're not working. What's wrong with you? I'll be like, hey, I noticed you seem to be really down today. Like you aren't really participating. Like I wanted to see if everything's okay. And usually they really appreciate that. And sometimes if nothing is wrong and they're just not participating, they're kind of like, oh, and they get kind of like embarrassed that like they got caught not participating, you know. But then on the other hand, if something actually is wrong, it's kind of like another chance to connect with them and to give them that support, because sometimes there are major issues going on in their lives. Other times there's kids that are just being that way. It's kind of more typical that they're not participating. And so if it's that kind of a case, I usually will talk with them after class. I never like to like reprimand them, basically. I never do it in front of other students unless, you know, if something says something, you know, crazy right in the moment. But if they're not participating and it's a constant problem, but they're not being disruptive, you kind of have to think about, like, if you call out the student in front of everyone and they get mad and like blow up, that's going to be a way bigger issue than them just not participating. So usually I'll start out with a kid like that if I notice like a couple days in a row, because you'll notice kind of at the start of the school year who those kids are usually going to be. I'll just have them stay after class, and I'll just have that conversation with them and say, like, look, part of this class expectation is that you participate, and I've noticed that you aren't, and you're going to lose points for that, for not participating. And I'll tell them, like, and now that I've noticed that you're not participating, I'm going to be calling on you more because I want you to give you the chance to earn those points. So, which they love. So kind of like that threat of like, well, I'm going to call on you more now. Usually like whips them into shape a little bit because usually it'll be like the next day and I'll see them not writing, and I'll kind of, when they're all working, I'll kind of walk past their desk and I'll say quietly to them, like, just to let you know, I'm going to call on you to answer this one. And then normally they're like, what? And then I'll call on them. And then half the time they'll be like, I don't know, I didn't write an answer. And I'm like, well, what do you think? Just off like, just right now, like, what do you think? And I like make them come up with something, So usually that'll kind of get them to realize the expectations, because that's what it comes down to, is a lot of students kind of realize that they can get away with not participating as long as they're not disruptive, because maybe in other classes they've gotten away with it. Because if you're not motivated to do the work and other teachers allow you to just basically sit and do nothing, like, you kind of get used to that being the norm. So I think it's kind of like restructuring that for them and helping them to realize, like, that's not going to be the norm in my classroom. And then the other case, the just outright disruptive students, my first year teaching, actually, I had a very highly energetic student that I will never forget, that it was a struggle. Because there are some kids that, they have all different, needs and abilities and issues. And there are some kids that it is hard for them to quietly sit and exist for that 54 minutes that we have them, and so sometimes you'll get students that are disruptive, but not, it's like they're not meaning to take things off the rails, they're disruptive in the way that they're overly commenting and overly participating and constantly trying to say their opinion about everything. And so if it's that kind of a kid, that it's more like they just want to participate all the time, because there's only so much time in a day. And so normally I'll pull those kids to the side after class and just kind of talk with them about that. Like, it's like, look, I appreciate that you are like interested in this, that you have stuff to say, but there are also 31 other students that I have to hear from. So while I really love like hearing your opinion, I can't only hear your opinion. And usually that takes care of that problem. The other kind of disruptive is, the negative disruptions, that they are just shouting out, or they're off task, or they're talking with their friend, or who knows what. So with kids like that, I mean, it depends on kind of like the seriousness of the offense. Like, if you have a kid stand up and like cuss out another kid in the middle of class, like, well, you have to send them to the office, because it's like, what just happened? Other times though, you'll have kids that it's like their best friend sits, 10 seats away from them, and they have to lean back and talk about like whatever happened on their video game, and whatever the heck, or like whatever happened in their sports game. Kids like that, usually I change their seat so they get preferential seating right by me. And so normally, and they'll normally realize, why they got moved, because they'll always make comments like, Mrs. Lydon, did you move me because I talk too much? And normally I'm like, I just want you right here next to me so I can hear all your great opinions. And they kind of realize, like how they're supposed to act. So it depends. Like, normally I will change their seating, like, because you'll notice sometimes they can't be near certain kids, like it amps up their disruptive tendencies too much. But so usually like seating changes, we're just reminding them over and over to stay on task can help. But if it's really bad, then you just have to send them up to the office, unfortunately, sometimes, because there are some kids that I'll talk with them after class, like several days. I'll give them reminders during class. But at a certain point, it just gets to be too much. Like they know that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing at a certain point. And so normally at that point, I'll have them after class one more time, and I'll just tell them, I'll explain it how it is. Like, look, I've given you a chance. I've given you time to fix this behavior, but you keep being disruptive and you keep, being off topic. And so from now on, if that's how you're going to be, I'm going to have to send you to the office because you can't take away from everyone else's learning time. And so usually that once they realize you're serious about that, usually that'll take care of it. And if not, then you do have to send them out of class, because at a certain point you have to realize that there are 31 other kids in there that need an education too. You can't spend all your time, correcting kids.
Absolutely. Well, spending your day in a room full of 30 to 35 kids 6 times a day is a very unique job. Are there any conceptions about teachers and education that you feel exist in our society and our culture at large that you'd like to talk about and dispel? To throw out an example, like teachers are only in it for the summer, like that would be an example of what I'm talking about. Or if you don't want to speak to that, are there any maybe misconceptions or expectations that a person that's about to graduate from the credential program and go out into their first year teaching, ideas that they may have about the profession that you think they may be thinking that aren't necessarily true, that you'd like to comment on?
Sure. So misconceptions. Yeah, the teachers are only in it for the summer thing is definitely one of them. So yeah, I mean, it is nice having summers off. I won't lie. That is nice. But the trade-off is that, I mean, do you really get the whole summer off? Like, yes, you don't have to report to work. Like, you don't have to go to your classroom. But I don't know many teachers who don't do work during the summer. You're usually always working on planning your units, like what you're going to do at the start of the school year, all that kind of thing. So while you don't have to physically be there, you have to mentally be there. So, and the trade-off too is it is a stressful job, like during the school year, there's a lot of stressful stuff that teachers have to deal with. Behavior issues, of course, but there's also, concerns in our world about, school shootings, lockdowns, things like that you have to be the calm adult presence in the room for any of those things. And, other than like at Turlock High School, we unfortunately had several students pass away this year. So, I mean, the emotional burden of that on us and on students, like, it's a very stressful job. And you hear all kinds of stories about students' families and, maybe unfortunate things that have happened to them in their past. And so, yeah, we get, winter break and summer break and stuff like that. But I think the trade-off is that it's a much more stressful job than I think some people realize. And I think we do kind of need those breaks too to kind of reset and get back to normal and to process things that we go through. And so I think another misconception that I hear is that like teachers are basically just babysitters. I hear that especially with like seniors, because I'll tell people that I teach seniors and they're like, oh, well, they're basically like self-sufficient at that point. And I'm like, like, you would hope, but no. So yeah, I'll hear people say that, like, basically teaching high school, you're just babysitting them. Like, they basically know their skills. They're surprisingly naive about a lot of things, like in life. And there are a lot of skills that they have not mastered yet. So no matter what grade level you're teaching, whether it's kindergarten or high school, like whatever it is, they're still kids, Yeah, part of your job is making sure that they are physically safe, which I guess is what babysitting is all about. But there's a lot more to it. Like, we have a lot of specific skills we have to teach. And I don't think people really realize like how much we take care of during the school year. Like, we all know that we're like mandated reporters, all that kind of thing. There's a lot of stuff on teachers' plates that we have to think about and deal with. And so it's a lot more of a complex profession than I think people realize.
Can you give as many examples as you can on top of your head when you said how many things you have on your plate as a teacher?
Just like what's on my plate. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just,
Yeah.
so that students get an idea for like,
Yeah.
you mentioned that it is really complex, and so maybe break
Mhm.
down the complexities of it.
So, I mean, first of all, obviously, is like the educational aspect. Um, it's not as easy, I think, as people think to teach just academically, because you're working with your PLC team to coordinate, and you might have different ideas and opinions about how best to teach something. And just because you think you're right, that doesn't mean that you're going to get your way. You know, there's kind of like a political aspect to even just creating lessons. That you have, there's that give and take in the collaboration of that, because just because you think that you're right, it doesn't mean that you're right. You know, like, you might try something that someone else suggested and you might be like, oh dang, like they were right, you know? So even just creating the lessons can be complex just because of that. Then we also have our like IEP meetings and 504s and things like that to take care of. I've been to several IEP meetings where you're pulled out of class time, you're given a sub, and you sit and you meet about one particular student. And then not even just the meetings itself, but then you have to make sure that you're following the IEPs and 504s. And it just it's a toss up really on how many students with IEPs and 504s that you have in a school year. Like this year, I think I have like 29 kids with with IEPs and 504s. And so you have to, first of all, remember who all has what accommodations, which is a lot, because there are all different kinds of accommodations. Like, some kids have 504s just for like anxiety. So that would have fewer accommodations than, another student, who has autism. Like, they would have an IEP that has a lot of different accommodations on it. And so keeping track of all of that is huge. I mean, you're legally bound to follow that, so you have to make sure that you follow it. Another consideration is that I have students with very bad allergies, like peanut allergies or like bee sting allergies, where they can go into anaphylactic shock because of it, which is scary, I'm sure you've seen ones where kids will have like different heart conditions where it's like, well, if they pass out, call 911. And then the entire school year, I'm like staring at them like, please don't pass out. So there's that. Then you have students who are in the foster care system or the group home system. And there's all different kinds of issues that come up with that. Like, luckily I mentioned, like, I worked in a foster care group home agency, so I'm a little more familiar with it. But kids who are in those types of placements, they have a whole different set of like stressors that they're dealing with. They're obviously placed there for a reason, and it's usually like a family dynamic problem. And a bunch of other things too. So you have to always kind of be aware of who those kids are. And, sometimes you have students who are homeless. And so you have to be aware of that, because if you ask students to go home over the weekend and do a certain project that requires materials, maybe they don't have access to them. And you can't really expect, a 17-year-old student to want to volunteer that information to you. You just kind of have to be aware of it. So anytime that you're planning something, you have to think about, the equity of it all, and, how to provide materials to students that may not have them. Like, for example, in my classroom, like I said, I'm really computer based, and they're all given the Chromebooks. So, I mean, that's equitable. But I have like a basket full of lined paper that I get from the school that I just have sitting on top of a filing cabinet in my room. And then I have another basket that's just full of highlighters that I personally bought, that I wrapped like kitty cat duct tape around them so they can't steal them. And then I have another one that just has like the wooden pencils that the school provides. And so it's like, anytime that I tell them to get out highlighters or to get out a piece of paper, I always just say like, oh, and if you want to borrow one of mine, it's just up there on the filing cabinet. And so it's really like normal for kids to like go grab one. Because I mean, a lot of times it's just kids that just are like, oh, I don't have a highlighter today. And so it doesn't make it weird for them. So you always have to kind of like think about that it's like, I mean, in high school, embarrassment is like a huge problem. They don't want to do anything that's going to embarrass them. And for a student to like admit that they're homeless, like that's, they're going to feel embarrassed about that usually. And so like, I find the easiest way is to just kind of think about all of that ahead of time with any of the activities that I'm doing. So that's part of it, is you're always kind of thinking about that. And then thinking about kind of like the social emotional issues that kids come across. Like if you're a teacher for long enough, you're going to hear like a lot. You know, I've had kids who are suicidal. And like I had a student once hand me a notebook and asked me to like read it. And of course it's at the end of class as they're walking out the door. They're like, "Oh, can you read this?" And I thought it was just going to be like a creative writing notebook. And I was like, "Oh, sure," you know. And I flipped through it and it's has like thoughts about suicide in it. And so then you're immediately like on red alert, you know, like you have to contact their counselor, you have to contact their next teacher to like get to make sure that the kid is pulled out and sent to their counselor. So there's stuff like that that just comes up out of the blue, you know, that it's like you always have to be prepared to respond appropriately to it, because you never know, like luckily in this circumstance it wasn't like a serious threat, you know, happy ending to the story. But you never know. So it's like there are always different issues like that that could and do come up, and you have to be ready, and you have to know what your school's policies are for dealing with it. You have to know like what the mandated reporting guidelines are, because you'll get kids that will tell you all kinds of stuff, and you have to respond to it appropriately. Like you are the adult that has to provide them support. And so, I mean, that's a huge part of it, is you kind of never know what's going to come up or when it's going to come up. And usually it comes up like right as the bell's about to ring. A kid, you know, will want to tell you whatever's been bothering, because, you know, they'll be sitting there, you know, and what I assume is they're probably sitting there during the class period, like worrying about it, like wondering, should I say something? Should I not? So then right at the end is when they're like, okay, I better say something. And then you're like, like, let's deal with this now. So I think that's a huge part of it, is like you never really know. And then there's also stuff that is less serious to us, but just as serious to them, like all of their like dating problems that they want to tell you about. And it can be hard because they want to get you wrapped up into their drama sometimes, and you have to obviously be the adult and, you know, not get involved, because that is not my business. You know, because I've had students in the same class period who were dating, and then they break up, and then they want to tell me about their horrible breakup and why I need to change the seating chart and this and that. And it's like, look. And so I always have to talk with them about like, look, you know, sometimes in a professional environment, like things come up that you have to just figure out how to deal with, you know, because they'll want to like change their schedule or something crazy. The only time that I will change a seating chart is if two kids like have like really bad personal issues, like I'm worried that they're going to like fight each other or something, you know. Like, but yeah, so it's you never really know what is going to come up with them. You'll have I've had kids in the middle of class that will just start crying and then like raise their hand and ask if they can go to the bathroom, and then they'll start digging out a bathroom pass, and I'm like, no, just go. And then obviously you have to check in with it, and because that's part of it too, is that something like that happens, a kid goes off to the bathroom to cry, and then you're waiting for them to come back, and you're wondering, you're stressing out about like, what is this about, what's going on, like, should I send someone to check on them, should I not, like. And I think that's, like I mentioned, like teaching is a lot more draining than like you would imagine it to be, and especially doing a full day of it, because there's stuff like that comes up that you're like, I don't know if it's like this for everyone, but for me, like I constantly question if like what I did was like what I should have done. Like could I have handled it better? You know, should I have done it this way or said this thing differently? It's kind of like that thing where like, you know, you think of a comeback like hours later and you're like, oh, I should have said this, you know? So I think that's a huge part of it, is kind of the working on your feet aspect, that you don't know what's going to come up or anything like that. So you're constantly kind of like stressing about that kind of thing, because stuff will always come up, you know?
Well, considering it's such a stressful job, this is a hypothetical question, but if you weren't teaching, what do you think you'd be doing?
Okay, if I wasn't teaching,
and you had to have a career.
Yeah. If I wasn't teaching, I probably would have gotten into like nonprofit type work. I did like working at Creative Alternatives. I liked like their mission and all of that. I probably would not have gone back to the field of psychology just because it wasn't quite the right fit for me. But I would probably like to do some sort of like nonprofit work. And it's still sort of education related. A lot of like different nonprofits will have some sort of like educational missions or things like that, or like philanthropy type work. So I'd probably be doing something like that. Like because part of the reason why I wanted to get into teaching was to kind of make a positive impact in the world on people and to help students. So I think I would still kind of be wanting to make that positive impact in a different way.
Excellent. And so I've kind of told you a little bit about the demographic that's going to be watching the video, people that are about to receive their credential and then get on the job market. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you really feel like that particular demographic should know? Are there any words of wisdom or encouragement, anything that you wish you had known or something that was said to you that was really useful?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I will always, I think, remember, like, I think, so my first day student teaching, I will always remember because, well, the first day that I really like took over a class, because you kind of have that moment that, all the students get quiet and they're staring at you and you're just kind of like, oh, like I'm the one in charge here. Like, and so then my first real day of teaching, where I was hired to do it, um, I felt so nervous because I feel like no one really tells you that, like, I don't think you ever really feel as prepared as you imagine your teachers were. Like, when I was in high school, I thought my teachers, like, had it all together. Like, they were all knowing and full of wisdom. And so then, my first day of teaching, where, you're expected to start building relationships with them and talk about your class rules and all this stuff. It's kind of like this moment where you're just kind of like, oh man, like this is real. Like I am the teacher now. Like, so it's kind of like crazy to wrap your head around a little bit. One thing I think that's important to think about is that as far as classroom management goes, I can't even remember who told me this, but someone told me, it's always easier to get more relaxed than to get stricter. And because I've seen a lot of like younger teachers kind of go on the more relaxed route a little too much, and then it is harder to like rein it all in. So I mean that was one thing that I thought was really helpful that someone told me is that not to I don't run my class like a like it's not super intense, but I'm always very clear and very firm about my boundaries and my rules and the consequences for breaking them. And I even tell students, just because I'm giving you detention or something like that, it doesn't mean that I'm personally angry with you. It just means that you broke one of the rules or you didn't follow one of the guidelines, and that is the consequence for it. And that's important because in the future, when you have a job, there's certain things you just can't do. You could get fired if you do that. So like the kid that, throws out the F-bomb in the middle of class. It's like, look, like most jobs, you can't just curse suddenly during them, So I think that's important is to find the right balance between being strict and still building rapport and having good relationships with them, because I think, you don't want too much one way or the other. And it is hard to figure out. It's hard to find a balance. Like my first, I would say 2 years teaching, I was way more strict than I am now, just because I do think that that's true. If you start out this school year and you're a little bit stricter than maybe you really want to be, you can realize that and you can change it and you can, change things up later on. But if you start out the school year and you're less strict, it is hard to get them to get back into shape. So for example, things like don't let students talk over you. If you're giving an instruction and kids are talking and you just raise your voice and talk louder to talk over them, the kids are going to learn really fast that they can just talk to each other whenever they feel like. And then that obviously leads to the problem of that, like, whoever's talking or being talked to has no idea what you just said. And so then all the time you'll get, wait, what? What did you say? And then you have to repeat yourself constantly. So setting up norms, I'll just tell them at the start of the year, like, if I have something to say and I ask you guys to be quiet, you all need to be quiet. And then I'll just stand there and like whoever's talking, I'll stare at them for a second and then I'll say like, so and so, could you please be quiet? And then normally they get quiet. And so they learn really quickly, like, look, this is an expectation. It's not necessarily that I'm being, overly rigid or anything like that. It's just like, look, guys, if I have an instruction to give, everyone needs to hear it. So I think there's a way to be stricter while still maintaining like kind of like a positive environment. And so finding that balance, I think, is important.
Excellent. All right. The big question, what is your favorite part about teaching? When you wake up, then you get coffee and you come to work, what are you most excited about? What lights you up about getting to come to work every day?
So my favorite part about teaching, it's two things. So first of all, it's having those relationships with students. Like I talked about, I love teaching seniors because I love getting to know them and to like cheer on their successes. So I really love, I try to make it to at least one sporting event, like one like sporting event per sport, I guess. So like I try to go to at least one football game, one basketball game, one soccer game. I'm not always successful, but I try, because I love like being able to connect with students on that level. Because some of them, like, they have parents who have never gone to their game before. And so I like to, like, it's as easy as, basketball games that like on a Thursday night at 7. Like, so one time during the basketball season, going out when you know that you have, 2 or 3 students on the basketball team and just cheering for them. Like, you don't even have to be there for the whole game. You could be there for like an hour and cheer for them, and they see you there and they realize like, oh wow, like Mrs. Lydon came to this game to see us. Like, and like when they get into college and stuff and they come up to you all excited to tell you about it, it's just amazing. Like, high schoolers get a reputation, I think, for being a tough group, being, hormonal and angry and angsty and all of that. But at the same time, they are like really wonderful people. They have dreams. They have all these ideas of how they want to improve the world, how they want to help other people. And I think it's amazing to get to hear that and to be trusted with, their ideas and their thoughts, and to see where they go with it all. So, I mean, I love that. And the other part that I love is like talking with other teachers, honestly. I like being able to like joke around with my coworkers. Luckily, like in our department, we get along pretty well, so it's nice to be able to have kind of that like professional collaboration and to have that support from other people. And I think that's really important, is to find like a school where you feel supported. You won't necessarily super get along with every single person in your department, and that's fine. I think as long as you can find like a key group of teachers that can just like support you, that, when you have a tough day, you can go and just tell them like, oh my gosh, I need to tell you what just happened today. Or when you have something really cool happen, that you can just go and like talk with them about it. And so you get that kind of extra level of support from them. So I love that too.
All right, perfect. Last question. Can you recommend to us, educational or not, either a movie, a book, or an album that you have read, watched, or listened to lately?
Oh man. So it's not education related really, but I just finished reading a book called This Tender Land, which was amazing. It's kind of like a more modern day, like Huck Finn kind of story. It's a good one. So This Tender Land, if you have any extra reading time available to you.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you on behalf of my students. So much great stuff that you said that they can reflect on and pull from, and they get to hear from a wide variety of voices and educators, and we just so much appreciate your time. So thank you for spending the hour with us and giving us so much
For sure.
about